please introducing yourself and giving a little background into the mental health practice that you do and the kind of work that you do?
Sure. So, hi, good morning, afternoon, and or evening, everyone. My name is Daniel José Gaztambide Núñez. I am the Assistant Director of Clinical Training at the New School for Social Research, and I'm also the Director of the Frantz Fanon Lab for Intersectional Psychology, and I'm a clinical psychologist in private practice. Most of my work today focuses on curriculum development for incoming MA and PhD clinical psych students focused on psychotherapy practice in social context in an increasingly diverse and complex world, alongside doing research on identity, mental health, disparities, and race, and having a private practice that focuses on a pretty generalist population, but in particular, people of color struggling and navigating issues of identity and relationships. That's me in a nutshell.
Very cool. Very cool. So, what do you, as a mental health provider, consider to be a healthy mind?
A healthy mind. I can't really answer that in terms of a mind so much as minding, insofar as a healthy mind is really determined by a network of minds that are, in a sense, minding and taking care of each other. So it's not just an individual component for me. So having a mind that is cared for and minded by others so that it's then able to, as Freud used to say, to be able to work and also to love, right? That's a relatively boiled down and simple way of talking about it. But I would almost say take anything that any mental health practitioner says about what makes a healthy mind and then just put it in a context. What kind of networks actually facilitate somebody being able to fulfill those different roles and needs, whether it's having a sense of hope and a sense of tomorrow, a sense of resilience, and et cetera. Think less about what makes an individual mind that way and what context actually makes that mind healthy. So, in other words, a healthy mind sits in the context of a healthy community.
I definitely resonate with that. And I agree with, it's the community that you're in that promotes how you feel and how you're reacting to your surroundings as well. So
100%.
how do you take care of your mental health? How do you keep a healthy mindset, and how do you improve your mental health?
Oh, no, you're asking me at a personal level now? Like, how do I take care of my own mind?
Well,
Or, or more like,
for people, for
more
all
like for people.
people.
Right. So taking me out of the category people, that I see what you're doing.
Well, including
Um,
yourself.
I would, including myself, fine, fine. I would say, following that same schema that I outlined earlier, um, the simplest way would be, how do you find yourself in relationship, connected to other people, and in community? So, more concretely, not just how do you find yourself spending your day, but how do you find yourself spending your day in relation to other people, whether that's, currently in this COVID context, whether that's on social media, online, physically, insofar as you're in a safe context with others in your surround, whether it's friends, family, loved ones, neighbors. How do you find yourself interacting day to day with others? We often have an intuitive sense that this matters profoundly, that to the extent we're able to engage with other people, that has an impact on our well being. So that it's not just, going for a jog or doing mindfulness on an app, but it's finding those spaces not just to take care of yourself in the eat ice cream and play video games sort of way, but also take care of yourself by, in a sense, taking care of and interacting with other people. And nowadays, there's so many mediums for doing that online, given the restrictions that we're currently in, whether that's finding, if you're interested in underwater basket weaving, finding a meetup group that meets online or via Zoom that talks about those interests, so that you don't have to think about what do you come up with that's interesting. There's already a shared interest in the group that people can organically talk about without feeling that they have to be in the spotlight somehow.
Definitely. So from what I understand you're saying is this is in the more general context of your day-to-day lives. Now, in terms of actual mental health um, treatment or mental health services, what barriers do you think limit access to those kinds of services?
Oh, how much time you got? When you sit back and think about it from like a, you know, scholarly public mental health point of view, it can seem so big. I mean, at the macro level, you have the usual suspects like, access to healthcare, the underlying healthcare system, different inequalities in terms of class, race, and so forth that structure who is able to have access and who doesn't, trickling all the way down to the intimacy of everyday life. So, for example, noticing that you're not having such a great day and a family member says, you're just being lazy, or, what's wrong with you? Like, that kind of stuff's for crazy people, et cetera, et cetera. So all those different kinds of culturally textured stigmas about what you do when you're not feeling so good and where and how do you get help. Like that often is kind of a first line barrier for many of us, like just getting to the point of showing and articulating that we need help, which then gets to the next level. From whom do we get help? Who do we talk to? Who do we feel safe with? Getting some direction in terms of where to go. And sometimes we don't necessarily have the best supports when it comes to mental health, because you might get told, it's only a spiritual matter. Spirituality is important, but there are certain things that a spiritual leader can do that don't necessarily mesh with what a mental health person or practitioner can do. So being able to figure out who to reach out to get that help, then you actually have to take action to go find it. And that gets into the whole morass of trying to find a therapist or try to find a clinic that's able to serve you given the resources that you have. And that's usually where people tend to get lost. Like if one level is just accepting that you need to reach out for help and getting the support from people around you to actually go get it, then they're surfing through Psychology Today trying to find your person, or navigating various clinics and hospitals trying to just get an appointment and land somewhere. And there it becomes very web-like in terms of all the things that interact that can not just physically prevent you from getting help, but that might demoralize you and make you feel like, you know what, maybe I don't have time for this right now. This is too overwhelming. If I were to pick out of these different things, which seems to be the most critical, I mean, the obvious is the macro systemic issues, because when things are bureaucratic and convoluted, it's like trying to, connect or disconnect your internet. Like if you have to talk to more than 5 people on the phone, you might not be so enthused. But probably the second one would be how it makes us feel to try to navigate these things to begin with, just to make a connection with someone. But suppose you get through all that. Suppose you get through the stigma. Suppose you find the people who support you in getting help, and then you actually get an appointment and you sit with someone for 45 minutes to an hour to do that first, maybe that first session or that intake. An additional barrier that come up there is not just whether you feel a fit or a sense of chemistry with your therapist, but it's also whether your potential therapist is able to connect with you, not just at an individual level, but in a way that understands where you come from, what your values are, maybe the community that you come from that may not have had the best experiences with mental health services. So getting through all that to find someone that you feel good and safe with can also present kind of an underlying barrier as well, right? To be able to find somebody that feels good, as opposed to just kind of locking in and saying, you know what, I just got to stick with it, even if it doesn't feel like the right fit. Because then what can happen, as we know from the psychotherapy research literature, is people can either not benefit from treatment or find that they're not really being understood and drop out of treatment ultimately, which might lead them then to not look for treatment in a very, very long time.
Definitely. So, how do you think things like NYC Well or crisis text line or these resources that are more general sort of fit into mental health access? Because it seems like, not having the right fit can actually be detrimental in getting access to mental health care. So, how do you think that these services that are out there can be helpful or harmful?
Absolutely. I mean, I start with what's incredibly helpful and resource rich about services like NYC Well. I mean, every experience I had, whether it's calling NYC Well directly to get a referral for someone or recommending someone to contact NYC Well themselves, you usually get anywhere from 8 to 12 or more possible sites that either take your insurance or are low fee, low cost, or no cost, no fee in your area, in your vicinity that's accessible, right? And I think there's something about getting somebody on the phone who can get all those resources for you and then just get you the list and help narrow the scope of your search. I think in some ways, if you could do that for clinics and hospitals, but also for everybody, just that would be a tremendous service. So in that way, there's a lot there that's good. What's not so good is that you can see there again a kind of wealth and even racial inequality in terms of who uses NYC Well versus who finds someone direct from Psychology Today. Like if you've got insurance or a very high income and you go on Psychology Today and you ping someone, then you might be more likely to get reached back out than somebody who doesn't have insurance or is very low income, right? When, speaking of this apartment that I just moved into, I learned that when I hit up a potential broker and I said, here's my income, here's my credit score, and here's my profession, I would get people getting back at me like that versus if I just said, hi, I'm interested in this apartment, right? And I share that more personal example to underscore just how conditions of wealth and perceptions of wealth can impact somebody being able to get care. To bring it back to psychotherapy, we have research that shows that when somebody hears someone on the phone and detects an accent or sees a name that is perceived as non-white, then somebody might be more likely to call back that person also, right? So those are real things that can get in the way, which then lead to not just an obstacle, but also some feelings that can be internalized. For example, if I can only get help by calling NYC Well, and I have to go to this clinic that specifically provides low fee treatment or no fee treatment, then what does that say about me and my value as a human being, that I have to be on multiple lists, that I have to call multiple places just so I can be seen? And I mean that both literally and metaphorically.
Of course, of course. So we've touched on a little bit surrounding cost, and you're absolutely right in terms of getting access to free and low cost services. NYC Well and similar resources are super helpful. But some therapists or even when you're on like Psychology Today, for people who don't really know what's out there, who don't really know that NYC Well is an option, and just kind of go on Google and try to look for a therapist, the cost can range from like 150 to $300 sometimes, and it's really expensive. And how do
Absolutely.
you see cost as a barrier in terms of for people who don't have the access or the knowledge of things like NYC Well yet?
I mean, cost is in some respects the most obvious barrier, even from jump. Like, how can I afford psychotherapy when there's so many other things going on in my life, right? Just to take a step back to that, both from testimonials as well as ongoing research, even though we know psychotherapy, whether it's in a scaled fee or full fee or whatever the cost, we know that it helps people save money. Let me repeat that. Psychotherapy, paradoxically, actually helps individuals save money because, among other things, it not only helps them address the presenting problem that brought them to therapy, it can provide them with more general problem solving tools that can help them make decisions that will ultimately help not just their well being, but also their bottom line. So somebody who's able to become more assertive to ask for that raise that they deserve is going to be much more likely to get it. Somebody who's able to make better decisions in terms of their finances, what kind of risks they take, how they protect themselves, both emotionally, personally, as well as financially, is much more likely to see a return, right, in the investment of psychotherapy, because it not only helps you personally, but also provides you tools to be able to navigate our social world, which, and we don't like to talk about it this way, but which also involves navigating a world that's unequal, a world where money talks, and where that winds up being part of the lubricant of our ability to just get around. So I just want to put that out there, first of all, that psychotherapy is not just something you spend money on for your own well being, but something that you can actually see a return, both at the individual level as well as at the national level. Like, we actually, as a society, get money back when people are doing well and they're healthy. Um, to get back to your original question, the anxiety around how much it's going to cost does deter many people. And what folks often don't know, because many clinicians don't often advertise it, is that people tend to have some range of what's called scaled fee or low fee slots. These are not sympathy slots. These are not pity slots. These are people's ways of saying, hey, if I'm able to serve people who can pay my full fee, then not only am I good, but that allows me to defer the cost of other treatments for people who need it. So, for example, somebody that I might talk to, and we realize early on that yes, cost has been a barrier, but we feel like we're a good fit and we could do good work together to help them with their problem. Then I might say, look, given what you're saying, I'd like to offer you this slot that works within your budget. And you might have some feelings about that, about what it means in terms of you, what it means in terms of me. Let's talk about that also and make that an explicit conversation in our work together, right? Our fears around money and what that means about us can become an additional barrier, not just to us getting help, but to reaching out to a clinician and saying, hey, do you happen to have any available slots for folks who can't afford your full fee? And most clinicians do have that. They don't advertise it, in large part because they are trying to fill up the slots that they need in order to keep the lights on, take care of themselves, in order to then provide those services. But I can guarantee that most clinicians have some variant of that. I often encourage that to people, uh, before going to, say, clinics and hospitals and stuff like that, because people owe it to themselves to try to find a clinician that's a good fit for them. I'm not saying that as a negative in terms of clinics and groups and hospitals, but it is important to underscore that your choices, your range in terms of who you can get paired up with is a little bit more narrow. Versus if you reach out to someone in psychology today, you can tailor it a little bit more to what it is you need and what you're looking for. That, does that make sense?
Definitely. I mean, you go on Psychology Today and you can see like what the provider specializes in, sort of where their background is, and that you have a better understanding of what a good fit is for you. And even then, sometimes you can go and it doesn't work out, and kind of take a step
Absolutely.
back and think, okay, maybe I should try a different provider. So speaking of accessibility for providers, with COVID-19, so much has opened up for mental health services in terms of telehealth and just access to online therapy and mental health services. So how do you think online and traditional in-person therapy differ, and can online therapy really do the same job as in-person therapy?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'll try to speak to it both at a personal level and what's sort of coming out now in terms of available extant research. I mean, on the one hand, my own experience, with the caveat that prior to COVID, I had maybe a quarter of my practice was already online, just because I work with a lot of people of color who may live in more rural settings where there aren't a lot of therapists of color who can work with certain issues. So I already had a substantial portion of my practice online. And so when we transitioned because of COVID, I probably had a more natural transition because I was already doing a lot of that work. So I didn't really experience a difference in terms of how I work and the kind of things that I do with clients. My clients do tell me that they experience a difference in that there's something about being on Zoom versus being in the room together physically that almost give them permission to be more candid than if they were physically in the room. Like somehow the virtuality of it made the kind of evaluation fears of being judged or shamed. It made them kind of it attenuated them basically. Like it felt a little bit safer to do things digitally than to do things online,
Sure.
which is almost like that sense of what's the term? It's not plausible deniability, it's something else, but the way that you can post online and be kind of anonymous, that kind of thing. It's a little bit like that almost. So if I tie that into what we know from research on telehealth before COVID and after, on the one hand, it seems like teletherapy is just as effective as in-person therapy. That's one. Two, there is evidence that teletherapy can just reach more people. Because if you're, for example, working 12 hours a day, you can't just take time off to go to somebody's office. But if you can take 45 minutes and just get on your phone and see your therapist, in your home or somewhere at work, like that's going to make it obviously more accessible for more people. The problem that starts coming in is when it's woven into your digital life. So if you're at work, say for people who work from home, and you're on Zoom all day, and then you also have to see your therapist via Zoom or whatever platform, then that adds into your Zoom fatigue. I'm saying for the client, but that also for the therapist as well.
Sure.
So teletherapy can be very useful. We have this saying back home, lo poquito gusta, lo mucho enfada. A little bit is good, but too much is distressing or upsetting. And I would very much see that in the case of teletherapy. It can be useful, it can be an amazing tool, but for clinicians to be in it all day, you're getting all sorts of essays and testimonials coming out of clinicians just being just brutalized emotionally from seeing just about or even higher caseloads post COVID than before, and all of that being mediated through Zoom. Similarly, on the client side, folks who are already experiencing Zoom fatigue from work or from dealing with their kids and teachers in school and all that, and then also doing what's supposed to be this more intimate space to help people breathe and get some room to mind their own mind.
Mhm.
Well, that's also on Zoom. And it would be like, being in your workplace and doing all your stuff and then going down the hall to see your therapist. Like there's no boundary, right? So that gets at the more negative side of it, where you can have the sense sometimes that there isn't a boundary between, for clients, their everyday life and then their therapy. And then for clinicians, also everything else. And then the work that they're doing and then their own supervision, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in a way, there's a way where it should be that way. I mean, psychotherapy exists in the world like everything else, but we need to at least have some sense of boundaries just to feel coherent and to feel safe. And
Mhm.
so you're seeing now with different restrictions being lifted, more and more patients and therapists having the conversation. What do you think about going back to the office? What would it be like for you? What would we gain and what would we lose if we do that? Some folks have told me like, oh, this is great. I could just, see you whatever time and I don't have to commute to your office. It's fantastic. And then other people are more like, I feel like I really want to be in the room with you
Mhm.
and actually take that as an opportunity to leave my office, leave my home, go somewhere else and just have space. So it's going to have, and well, it already has its benefits as well as its costs. And we need to be more mindful, not just to apply telehealth like that's the thing now for everything, but to try to study a little bit more empirically in what ways can telehealth be a boon for, say, rural communities, for communities that are marginalized that don't often have access to psychotherapy, but also what are the costs relative to in-person psychotherapy. Like in terms of outcomes, I think they're both relatively equivalent. But when you start putting more stuff on it, then I think it could start to have diminishing returns.
That's a very interesting perspective. I haven't heard the concept of, adding it onto your workday on Zoom calls. And, coming from a personal space where I do go in every day. So I'm not on Zoom calls every day. So for me, Zoom calls would be, I wouldn't see it the same way. But you're absolutely correct for people who are on Zoom calls for 9 to 5, from 9 to 5. And then it's just an added, stressor of, oh my goodness, I have to be back on that computer and sit down on a chair again. So I have one other question for you. For today's world, with the conversation around mental health changing in the younger population, with social media and influencers being really outspoken about mental health, have you noticed any changes in who's coming in for therapy, or if younger people are coming in for therapy, or if the conversation is sort of changing?
I mean, I would almost say that as much as these different technologies are innovative and they're changing how we talk and how we live, et cetera, it's not fundamentally changing what we talk about and what we do with each other. It's just taking all those things and put them on speed. I mean, let's think of a world prior to social media for a second and think about what are some of the issues that just bring people to therapy. On one level, you could think of, relationships and intimacy and all that stuff, right? The question of our intimate lives. But then on another level, you have these other issues that are a little more vertical, like what is my value and how do I fit into my society, and who's greater and who's lesser, and am I not achieving more because I'm lazy, or I just got to get it right, right? All of that language that we talk, with in our everyday life is much more organized around where we sit in the world in terms of social comparisons,
Mhm.
right? And it's not just that that's always been there, in some universal sense. It's always been there in our society. So when you bring in social media, which is all about social comparison, how many likes do you get? How much are you retweeted? What influence are you having? What's your ratio, as the kids say online? That creates an environment where you're on the spotlight 24/7. I mean, to go back to Zoom, if there's something my students often say, is that before, when they're in the classroom and they speak up, they're just one voice among many. When they try to speak up in class via Zoom, it feels like automatically the spotlight's on them, right? So on social media, you're on 24/7. Like somebody can talk to you at any time and say anything about you and evaluate you in any kind of way, um, without necessarily your consent or even your awareness that that's happening. So all of those issues that have always existed have now become hypercharged. So when people come into therapy today, it certainly is in one way all of those issues, but again, the how we talk about those issues has changed in a way that in some ways, I would almost say it's good because it makes all of these issues that much more salient. That we're in a society where we're trying to gauge where it is we are in the pecking order, whether that's about wealth or beauty or how many followers you have or race or gender or sexuality. All of that goes into the pot. And more than ever, people are always kind of scanning like, who likes me and why don't they like me? And where am I in the community? What's probably made it challenging to talk about is that people come to therapy knowing that there's something going on, that they're not happy or they're anxious or they're depressed or they're whatever. But to really get at how it's some of these things that's underlying your anxiety, your depression, your feeling of disconnectedness, comes a little too close to the issue and in some ways is threatening, right? Does that make sense? Like the issue that's making you feel bad, to put it bluntly, is being compared to others and having others see you. So if you're coming into a space where somebody's job is to see you, then you're in another relationship where you might be evaluated and compared.
Yeah, and definitely that can be, an added stress or added level of anxiety associated with that. So what would you say to someone who's either new to therapy or someone who's, sort of started looking into the options of mental health treatment and then on the fence, or like you said, feeling that anxiety about being judged, being in the spotlight? Especially, I thought it was so interesting that you use the term spotlight because Zoom literally calls it spotlighting.
Right, right. I mean, if I understand your question, like, what would I say to someone who's looking for therapy today?
Well, someone who's maybe new to therapy, or yeah, someone who's
Okay,
considering the options but is sort of on the fence because they feel like, well, why do I want to go into another space where I'm judged? Because this is the source of
right,
my anxiety.
right, right. I mean, what I would say is it makes perfect sense not to want to go through the grind of finding a therapist and then sit across from them and then feel, judged or not accepted, etc. Like it makes sense not to want to go through all that. But at the same time, if you're asking that question, it's because something is hurting so much that you're thinking about getting that help.
Mhm.
So then the question becomes, what is kind of more important and valuable to you right now? Is it making sure that you don't get judged in another space, which totally makes sense? Or is it taking that risk of potentially being judged to be able to get the help that you need to address this hurt? And not just address a hurt, but what the hurt is preventing you from getting at, right? We always say to a therapist, like, I want to be less depressed, or I want to be less anxious, or I want to be, someone people like or feel good about, whatever. Think about if those things weren't in the way, right? So if you didn't feel that anxiety, if you didn't feel that depression, if you didn't feel that worry about, whatever it is, what then would you be doing? Like, what would that free you up to achieve? And I would encourage you not just to think about what that is, but to hold that as your North Star. Because if that is what you're trying to get at, then is that more valuable and important than your fear? Because if it is, then the choice becomes a little more clear. But then you already done like 3/4 of the work of the first session, which is to just articulate to your therapist, not just what you want to get rid of, but what it is you want to get to and reach, because that's going to make your own life richer.
Sure. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us. And Mind the Gap Initiative and me, we all truly appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday morning to answer so many questions. And I think you've given a lot of valuable information and a lot to reflect upon in terms of what accessibility means for mental health and who's getting it and who's not, and how you can not even just treatment, but how you can interact with your community to promote your mental health. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure.